Someone contacted me with a great tale of woe. They've got a Reflex 3 and it's jammed. Can't move the film advance. Of course, the standard answer is that the frame counter is set to number 1 and it's locked the film advance. And the standard practice is you press the button here and it advances the counter and then you can move the film advance. Except the button does nothing. It's not working. Something is broken in there. So how would you go about fixing that problem? Well, we've got to start taking things apart. So we're going to need all the leatherette off and all the base. So I'm going to start with the surround for the tripod socket. Those screws are easily damaged, so be careful with them. There's the back catch cover, and here's the return spring for the back catch cover. The leatherette patch on the film advance lever. See if I can slide under that with the scalpel. That's coming off. The adhesive is quite gooey. It's certain, I think that's certainly been serviced before, I would say. So 3 screws on the film advance lever. If you've just got a Retina Reflex 3 and you can't move the film advance lever and you've pressed the button and the frame counter doesn't move, then you've got no way of testing the camera for other functions. Right, so the leatherette off the base next. I'm using my scalpel. Got to get it underneath. Given the state of this adhesive, I'd say that this one, if it gave me any trouble at all, would come loose. Here I'm just lifting that up, but I'd say a little drop of naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, would probably soften that adhesive and that would come straight off. It would just peel up. Let's see how we get on. I'll pour some in here. Yeah, that just immediately released it. So the adhesive was ready to go. Put a drop under that. And the leatherette's off the base of the camera. You can see by the amount of adhesive on there that this has been serviced before. Now, to find out what's happening with our frame counter, we need to take the chrome trim off the bottom of the camera, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 screws. Before you lift this plate off the bottom of the camera, you need to be aware that there is a spring for the capping plate. Underneath this chrome plate, and that spring is easily lost if you are not aware of its presence. It may lift off with the chrome plate, or you may tip the camera over and it may disappear. And also be aware that the shutter won't work properly if that spring's not present. Okay, so we've got our screws out, off with the chrome plate. Here is the spring I spoke of. Oh no, that's not the one I'm talking about. That one is for the lock lever. This is the one I'm thinking of, this little fine one here. This very narrow one, taller one, it's taller and smaller diameter, that's for our lock lever. This lever here is the lever that moves our frame counter. There's a return spring for it at this point. Let's lift this lever out, because I think the end of it's probably bent. Yeah, it is. I'll zoom you in a bit. You can see nothing. That should do. I think you can see there the end of that piece is folded over. It's hook shaped. It should be pretty much a straight line. So basically the end of it is folded over. Once it's folded over, there's absolutely no danger it will move the settings wheel. So probably I'm going to have to replace this. The chances of that straightening out without snapping are not particularly good, but I'll give it a go. We'll go back to looking at the camera itself. I want to see if the wheel is unusually stiff, so that even replacing it with a new part would cause us problems. Now down in here where you can't see because it's too dark, I can just see the wheel, the frame counter wheel, and I'm just checking to see if it will move. It's very stiff. This piece, this is our lock lever, let's lift that out. This is the piece that locks the film advance. This is the lever that lifts it out of the film advance to allow it to move. It's got a return spring here, and this piece is supposed to be moved by the frame counter. It doesn't feel particularly stiff, but the frame counter wheel here should push this out of the way when you push on it to move it past number 1, and everything should move smoothly. Let's just take this out, this lever. I might not be able to get it out actually, because generally speaking it's well trapped down here. We'll leave it where it is. I'm going back to have prodding underneath here, seeing what that wheel's like to move. Yeah, you can see that. As I come up to number 1, this is dropped down. As we move the frame counter to the diamond position, you should see this lever move forward, which would lift the lock lever out of mesh with the shutter release, film advance. And it does. But this feels stiff to me. That whole wheel doesn't move as freely as it should do. So I think we're going to have to take that off. Now, our problem there is quite simple. That screw is usually very, very tight. It's not unknown for the screw to get virtually demolished by the time you get the thing loose. So I've got a decent sized screwdriver here, and I'm going to have a go at getting that loose. Oh, that was loose. I was able to get that free without any fight. Normally I would have to fight. Often I'd have to put a pair of pliers on my screwdriver. Let's get this apart. Right, so here's our components. We've got the top here. I can see something on the bottom of it that may be grease. I'm hoping it's not glue. We know that the base had been, the leatherette had been glued on fairly generously. There's the frame counter disc itself, the numbered piece. We can lift this lock lever out now, or this lever that lifts the lock out of place, and this is the wheel that actually turns. There's a wavy washer underneath it, which gives it a little bit of resistance, and this thing here is the piece that turns. And as it gets round to this position, that lock lever get this back in here. That lock lever can drop in like that. And as it's rotated, it pushes the lock lever out of the way. And it goes right round until we come back to the start position, bang, and that drops in there. There's no return spring on this counter. That counter turns a complete 360 degrees. Unlike a Reflex 4, where it basically stops counting and returns to the 0 position when you open the camera back. So these components will just need to be cleaned, I would think. And then I want to see that that actually moves quite freely once it's been cleaned. Because unless it moves freely, we're just going to ruin a piece like this. The end of that, you can see where that sits in the casting there. And here's our wheel, which sits like that. In fact, it sits the other way up. It sits like that. This hook should be just straight, and it pushes the counter in this direction. In this piece, we can move it with a button to change the frame counter, but it's also moved by the film advance. So as the film advance here rotates round to the end of the stroke, this tab hits this and pushes this forward, which advances our frame counter by 1 count each time. So I've got to clean these components up. I've got to see if I can straighten this thing up and get that back into a useful state. And after that, in theory, we'll be able to find out if the camera works. So first things first, clean all these components. Here I'm just using Naphtha cigarette lighter fluid, and I'm getting rid of all of the old grease. The grease may have gone dry and sticky. This doesn't feel too bad, so it means it's a bit of a mystery as to why this failed. It is sticky, but it's not as sticky as I would have expected. The fact that the screw came out of the counter wheel so easily is unusual. It may mean that it's been taken apart before, which of course might mean that that it has some history. It's had a problem before. Generally speaking, if you're doing a shutter on a camera like this and the camera was otherwise in good condition and you were feeling lazy and didn't want to completely service the camera, you wouldn't even take this thing apart. You'd leave it on the camera. Okay. So I'm looking at this piece at the bottom and I'm wondering whether that's been damaged. If the camera had been bashed on the ground, the edge of this, particularly this piece here, this edge here is fairly weak. If that had been hit on the ground, that might have folded in and it might be applying too much pressure to the frame counter and causing it to stick. I'll just get the camera back in here and just clean this surface here, because that's what that wavy washer runs on, and these tracks of course are the tracks that the lever runs on. And our return springs for our 2 levers sit here and here. Now I'll inspect this counter disc here, see if it looks distorted. It doesn't look entirely flat. I don't think it's badly enough out of shape to cause a problem. I'll put this back together and see how it goes. So first of all, I'm going to leave the levers out. I'm just going to put these components back in. And its large retaining screw from the centre is there, of course. Okay, so what I want to do, I'll put some synthetic grease on the wavy washer. That goes in first. If this camera will hurry up and focus. Not today. Is it thinking about it? Yeah, it's getting there. There's our wavy washer. Here is our wheel. Here is our counter. Now I'm just going to put that on any old way at the moment. It only goes on correctly one way, but you can fit it either of two ways. I'm not much interested at the moment. I just want to see if this wheel turns smoothly. And I'll pop the cover on in the centre. The screw down the middle. Now that does feel sticky. And run the screw home. Now I'm just going to push the wheel around manually and see how it feels. I'm just catching the edge of the wheel underneath here with my screwdriver. That doesn't feel bad at all. I'll tighten that right down, make sure it's as down firm, and try again, just to make sure that that does move smoothly. That has about as much resistance as I would normally expect. It certainly doesn't feel bad. Okay, so I will just check that I've got my frame counter disc on the right way there. You can put it one of two ways. Now here's our lever, our return lever, or this is what does our lock lever. You can only get it in with this screw loose. Oh, of course I've tightened that now. That'll do. So this lever, I'm going to lubricate that, and here I'm going to use molybdenum paste, but you can use grease. That end, I'm making sure I've just got some on the tip of that lever, and there's no friction underneath really. I'm being over generous with that paste there. You need very little of it. Let's slide this back into position. I'm interested to see if I've got my frame counter disc on the right way or whether I've got it reversed. Let's just check. We'll turn this round to towards number 1. I'll keep a bit of tension on this lever with my finger, pushing it towards the counter. Yeah, it just dropped into place. So I've got my counter around the right way, that all looks good. So I'll just tighten that up a little bit. And I want to put my return spring in place for that lever. My return spring is one of these two things. And the spring acts against the tab there to push that towards the rewind end of the camera. I've got to get this in underneath this lever, see if this will work for me. Not today by the looks of it. Perhaps I can turn the tail of the spring around here. Just seeing if that spring's sitting where it should be. No, it's not. It's not sitting underneath that tab. These springs are awkward on a good day. That's it. So now it's sprung loaded, and the spring is acting to push it into the counter. I'm going to see if I can straighten the hook on this. I don't really rate my chances particularly high, but we'll find out. Okay, let's see what I can do with this spring. It should look something like that. I've got some spares here, so I'll find one of those and we'll check it against that. Alright, so here's a spare part. You can see that's not really the same shape. It should be, the bent in piece should be just right at the tip, and it should be straight back at that point. So I'll have another go at reshaping that. I think that would probably work, but I'll just have a go at, yeah, I can see where the original bend would have been, right close to the tip. See if I can straighten that out a bit. I have to say it doesn't feel particularly robust, but we'll have a go with that. We'll put it in, see if we can make the camera work with it. If it works nicely, job done. If it doesn't, it'll have to be replaced. So it wants a return spring, and the return spring goes on the other way here because it is pushing that lever back towards the film advance. So I'll just get this positioned down in here. The lever, like I did before, I'm just going to give that a very, very light wipe of molybdenum paste on the underside. I'll slide that into position. You've got to be careful getting that in, that you don't damage it. And the spring has to be hooked into that notch on the arm, on the lever. And sitting right there. Has that spring popped out? It has. I'll get that spring, yeah, it's just popped away from where it needs to be. That's better. Our spring's in place. Now the lock lever can go in. This is the lock lever. I'm just going to give that a very light wipe on those two pins with some molybdenum paste. And I'm going to run some on that edge. That drops in there. Our springs. The narrower spring goes in there. The broader spring goes in here. And then the base plate can go on. Now this pin connects up with that little hole in the lever. And I might have to move my film advance to get that to drop on. That's just picked up the lever. I'll put some screws in the base plate. Since it's completely unknown whether straightening up that frame counter arm will fix this, because the spring may be weak, I'm only going to put a couple of screws in here before I fit the rewind, the advance lever. The screws are a bit reluctant to go in, they're a bit much glue around the top of those. Okay, so that's in place. We're on the diamond, so we should be able to move the film advance without any problems. This camera is a bit stiff to cock, but it does work. The frame counter is advancing. Now that's a good sign. It means that that lever, that spring that I straightened out, is working. Now, can I move the frame counter just by pushing the button? That's working smoothly too. So we'll get this round to the number one, because it locked at number one and caused us problems. It didn't want to move off number one, so I'm just going to move this to number one. Now that's where there'll be most resistance on here. Okay, you heard that snap in. The film advance is now locked. It will not move. I went to move it, it wouldn't move. Now, when I press this button, will it move the frame counter off number one? There's a lot of resistance there. And it's not doing it. It's not lifting it off number one. In fact, I can feel that the spring has given way. It's folded over. So there's too much resistance here, or the spring doesn't have enough stiffness to it. It's just too weak. So, all this off again, and we'll have another close look at the wheel and try a replacement part and see if that fixes the problem. As you can see, we're back where we started. That spring is folded over. I'll try the replacement part. Okay, so this time with the replacement lever, this moves fine. We'll get it round to the point where it locks and we'll see if we can move it off the locked position. It's just locked. And you can see that I was able to move that off the locked position without any problem. So I put the lever back on here now. We should be able to wind and fire this camera. So you can see that this camera is now functioning again. Whether it's any good is a different matter. There's probably got other problems with this camera. But that demonstrates that by cleaning everything and replacing this lever, we're away laughing. This spring is just too weak. It's I don't know whether they changed the tension of it, changed the material they used at any stage, or whether just having been bent once, it now folds over too easily. It should have looked like this. I don't really think that the new one I've got here is any stiffer. I think it feels like the same material. Might be stiffer. There may be more stiffness there. But basically, this, once it had been bent, it did not want to behave for us. We might have been able to muck around with it and bend it back and get it to work correctly, but I feel it's just weak now, weak from having been stressed. But that's what you would do anyway. Now in this case I'll just put my Leatherettes back on. This camera probably needs to be serviced. There's a reason it was sitting in my pile of dead cameras. But I'll deal with that. So most likely, if your lever looks like that with the end folded over, you're going to have to find a replacement part, either one taken from another camera or out of somebody's spare parts. Thanks for watching.